Good morning, everyone. So, today I have brought another interesting poem for all of you, which is titled as O Great Poets by Daya Pawar. It is one of the very important poem written by Daya Pawar, which is generally prescribed in BA syllabus. So, let's begin. First, understand who was Daya Pawar. So, Daya Pawar was a prominent Marathi writer, poet, and social activist from Maharashtra, and he is very popularly significantly known for his contribution to Dalit literature. He himself was a Dalit and he had faced so many prejudice, discrimination in early life, and that is what he actually used as his inspiration to write the work that he has written. And some of his notable work are Baluta. Baluta is very famous Dalit literature work, and it is autobiographical work in which he talks about his life discrimination, his struggles, and that's why it is very powerful. And then he is also associated with Dalit Panther. He's a founding member of Dalit Panther movement, and he wrote extensively about things and propagandas, objectives that is related with Dalit Panther. So Daya Pawar, Dalit writer, and he's very famous and powerful writer when it comes to Dalit literature. So that's the background of Daya Pawar. Now let's move and understand the poem, which is O Great Poets. So first thing that we have to understand that O Great Poets was written originally in Marathi and then it is translated by Graham Smith in English. Okay, that's the first thing. Now let's begin. It has three stanzas and here it goes. O Valmiki, should you sing the praises of Ram Rajya because you are the greatest poet of poets? Seeing the heroine wounded wings, your compassionate heart breaks out in lament. You were born outside the village in a shunned neighborhood where misery itself was born. So, in the first stanza, what you see, he is directly addressing to none other than poet Valmiki, who has written Ramayana, the greatest epic of Indian literature, Ramayana. So he is directly addressing Valmiki and he has some questions, he has some doubts, and that's what he is addressing to him. And he says that though you are the greatest poet, you have written Ramayana. And he says, should you sing the praises of Ram Raja because you're a great poet of poets? And this is a question that just because you have written about Ram Raja, can you be considered a great poet? That's the first question that he is asking to Valmiki. कि just because आपने रामायण लिखा है क्या हम आपको great poet बोल सकते हैं? Here, very important and prominent question he is raising. What makes a poet a great poet? That's a question, this central theme of this poem. What makes a poet a great poet? And in the context of Valmiki, he asked that just because you have written Ramayana, can you be called a great poet? And then he goes further. He says, seeing the heroine wounded wing, your compassionate heart broke out in lament. Now he's comparing one situation where you know the Ramayana episodes. Their heroine episode has happened where Jatayu goes to save Sita and then he got shut down by the Ravana. And he says that by seeing that very incident, your compassionate heart broke. You have written so much about that. You feel you felt so pity, you felt so much compassion for that one incident. But then in the next line itself, he says, but you were born outside the village in a shunned neighborhood where misery itself was born. But at the same time, he says because Valmiki also come from lower caste, he also belonged to lower community. So he says then that, but you were also born outside the village. You were living in that shunned neighborhood. You belong to the community that I also belong, the lower caste community, where misery itself was born. You come from a community jahan se misery itself born. जहाँ पे दुख दर्द की कोई कमी नहीं थी. So he is giving two example. One example he says that you saw a heron suffering and your heart melt, but then you come from the place where misery itself was born, where suffering itself was born. But then he goes further. He explained the misery part more about the locality that he was there. Never festooned with fruit or flower, the dejected faces furrowed with care. Is it true you never heard their lament as they cried for liberation? One shumbuk of your own blood caught fire, rose in anger. So now he's saying that how can it be possible that the place that you belong to, where misery was there, where so many suffering was there, where neither fruit, flower, dejected faces. तो ये कैसे हो सकता है कि जिस जगह से तुम बिलोंग करते थे, जिस जगह के आसपास सिर्फ दुख दर्द था, जहाँ पे लोगों के साथ डिस्क्रिमिनेशन हो रहा है, लोगों को वो अधिकार नहीं मिल रहे हैं जो उन्हें मिलने चाहिए, and you have never heard them because Valmiki never wrote about it. Valmiki only wrote about Ram Raja, he wrote about glorification of Rama, he wrote about princes, he wrote about kings, but he never wrote about the community, the suffering of the common man. And that's the question that he is bringing out. That's the question he's pointing out. That, their lament for liberation, you never heard, you never acknowledged, you never written a line about them. उस चीज के बारे में आपने कभी लिखा ही नहीं. And then he gives an example of Shambuk, that Shambuk of your own blood, he's also a mythological character. He caught fire, rose in anger. So what he's building on, he's building the marginalized community's voice. And that's how you can connect it to the Dalit literature. Dalit literature is nothing but, writing from margins. Most of the time we write about big people, kings, queens, their lives. But Dalit literature was actually aiming to bring the voices that no one has ever heard. And here he is again in this poem bringing it out that you wrote about big people, you wrote about Ram Raja, and can that be a reason you can be called great poet? Because आपने कभी उन चीजों के बारे में लिखा ही नहीं जहां कॉमन मैन की सफरिंग थी, वो कम्युनिटी की सफरिंग थी. So that's what he is pointing out in second stanza as well. And then we come to the final stanza. O great poet, singing the praises of Ram Rajya, even there the icy cliff of inhumanity towered up. So you are singing the praises of Ram Raj, no doubt. You're full of praise of Ram Raj. आप राम राज के बारे में लिख रहे हैं, full of praise कर रहे हैं. But उसी राम राज में icy cliff of inhumanity towered up. But उसी राम राज में there was so many inhumanity happening, there was so many discrimination happening, there was so many prejudice happening, people were suffering. But you never attempted to write, you never heard them, you never acknowledged them in your writing. Oh, great poet, how then should we call you a great poet? And then he comes the question of the poem that he is addressing. But if you have not addressed the voices of common man, if you have not addressed the voices of poor people, the community that you belong to, the suffering you belong to, how could you be called a great poet? Had you written just one single verse exposing this injustice, this outrage, then would your name have been carved on our hearts. And so here what he's saying, had you written, यदि आपने एक लाइन भी लिखी होती ना, यदि आपने एक लाइन भी डेडिकेट की होती इन सफरिंग को, कॉमन मैन की प्रॉब्लम्स को, then your name would have been in our heart. So that's how he ends. So just to summarize this poem, this is a very powerful poem. Very powerful poem because first of all, it is addressing the very important question, who can be called a great poet? So here the question is, what is the purpose of poetry? Just writing about big things, just writing about big people, is it enough? क्या ये काफी है किसी को अच्छा पोएट बनाने के लिए? So here he is talking about the purpose that is attached with the art with a purpose. That art is of no use if art cannot serve the common man. And then he has targeted none other than the Valmiki, who is the poet of the greatest epic of Indian literature. He directly questions him, and he questions him on the behalf of what he has done and what he expect him to do. कि वाल्मीकि जो सबसे बड़ा पोएट है जिन्होंने राम राज के बारे में लिखा है, पर राम राज के अंदर उन्होंने उन चीजों को नोटिस ही नहीं किया जहाँ पे सफरिंग था, जहाँ पे कॉमन मैन की प्रॉब्लम था, एंड उस वजह से he feels he cannot be called great poet, or can it be a called poet under question mark. He puts it under question mark, and with the realization he says कि यदि आपने एक लाइन भी लिखी होती ना तब आप हमारे दिलों में होते. So there's an anger, there's a question, there's so many, you know, underlying problems that he's addressing that has not been ever talked about. So that's why this is a very powerful poem, and it is bringing the very important thing: who can be called great poet? What makes a poet great poet? It's just writing anything, or it's just writing with a purpose? Is it talking about common people? So that's what the poem is trying to address. I hope this poem is clear to you. Three stanza poem, very small poem but very powerful poem. First, directly questioning to Valmiki here. He is directly questioning to Valmiki that you have sung the praises of Ramayana, but can you be a great poet? Then he gives the example that you could see the compassion, feel the compassion for heroine, for one animal, but you could not feel compassion for the fellow people around you. You never heard them, you never acknowledged their problems. So he gives and goes on to give an example of contrast. And then finally he comes back with the same question that he started with, that, you sing of Ram Raja, but in humanity that was there, you never addressed them. And if you have not, then how could you be called a great poet? That's the final thing, that how he's summarizing it. And he says finally that had you written even one line, we would have had you in our hearts. So with this, he ends the poem. I hope this poem is clear, and it is, you also like this poem. With this, we have come to the end, and bye bye.